November 1967. A jagged, jungle-choked ridge rising 900 meters above the remote, blood-slicked valley of Dak 2, hidden deep within the Con Tum province of the central highlands of South Vietnam. The weather in this specific sector of the Annamite Range is a living, breathing nightmare. A thick, freezing mountain mist, known to the local Montan tribesmen, rolls down from the nearby Cambodian border, swallowing the triple canopy forest in a solid, impenetrable wall of wet, gray blindness. The ambient temperature is dropping rapidly toward the low 50s as darkness falls. But inside the dense, tangled vegetation, the suffocating humidity makes the freezing air feel like a wet, dirty shroud wrapped around a man's lungs. Suddenly, a deafening explosion rocks the mud-slicked crest of the ridge. A hidden complex of North Vietnamese Ennie's Army Claymore-style mines, rocket-propelled grenades, and automatic weapons fire tires through the lead elements of an American infantry platoon. Within 3 seconds, the entire unit is cut completely in half, separated by a 30-yard killing zone of burning bamboo, shattered equipment, and flying steel. Screaming infantrymen throw themselves into the rotting leaf litter, their heavy leather canvas boots clawing desperately for traction in the slick, red volcanic clay, while an invisible enemy pours an unyielding wall of lead from reinforced log bunkers dug deep into the mountain. This is happening every hour. Every single hour, somewhere along the rugged and mountainous border where the Ho Chi Minh Trail bleeds into the highlands, young American boys are walking straight into carefully prepared, interlocking killing zones. The American soldiers are bleeding out in the dirt, their frantic, high-pitched shouts for a medic completely drowned out by the continuous, ear-splitting roar of the ambush. But amidst the chaotic thunder of the battle, there is one man who cannot afford to dive for cover, shield his face, or hide his head in the dirt. He is a 20-year-old draftee from the industrial flatlands of Toledo, Ohio, and on his back, he carries a heavy, rectangular aluminum box that turns him into the primary high-priority target for every single enemy marksman on that mountain. It is the ANL-PRC-25 tactical radio transceiver, and its long, flexible 10-foot steel whip antenna cuts through the green foliage like a lightning rod, signaling his exact position to the jungle. His name was Raymond Ray Vance, and before this night is over, he will not fire a single bullet from his rifle, nor will he storm an enemy bunker to win a silver star for the newspapers back home. He will simply sit in the freezing mud, pinned down behind the decaying roots of a banyan tree, forced to listen to the raw, unfiltered terror of his dying comrades screaming directly into his ears over the airwaves, while the heavy gray fog prevents the artillery batteries from saving them. To understand the profound, lifelong psychological trauma that Raymond Vance carried off that mountain ridge, you first need to understand that being an RTO, a radio telephone operator, in the jungles of Vietnam was a specialized form of mathematical suicide. In the brutal, pragmatic logic of infantry warfare, the civil TO was simultaneously the most critical tactical asset and the most hunted man in any platoon formation. The enemy snipers hidden in the upper canopy didn't look for the officers with their silver bars or the platoon sergeants with their leather stripes. They scanned the brush for the long, bouncing steel antenna that danced through the elephant grass like a pointer. They knew with absolute certainty that if you kill the radio, you blind the entire platoon.
You cut off their artillery coordinates,
their close air support, their emergency medical evacuation helicopters, and their only connection to the outside world. The average survival time of an RTO in a hot landing zone was regularly measured in mere minutes from the first opening shot. It was a war decided not by grand historical narratives or sweeping movements of massive divisions, but by a single 30-pound-off piece of communication hardware that transformed a quiet 19-year-old country boy into a walking target. And that story begins not on the blood-soaked ridges of DAC 2 in November, but months earlier in the freezing, grease-stained workshops of an electronics repair plant in Ohio, and later, on the sun-baked concrete tarmac of the 4th Infantry Division's base camp at Pleiku. Before the United States military strapped 30 pounds of aluminum and heavy magnesium batteries to his shoulders, Ray Vance's entire universe was defined by the clean, silent language of circuitry, the smell of Rosencore solder, and the predictable laws of electromagnetic waves. He was a quiet, deeply introverted boy who had spent his youth in his father's television and radio repair shop, a narrow brick building, surrounded by the constant hum of transformers and the yellow glow of old oscilloscopes. He was fascinated by the invisible threads of energy that could connect two human beings across great empty distances, traveling through alls and over mountains without leaving a trace. His father, a merchant Marine veteran who had spent the Second World War listening to the frantic Morse code signals in the dark, predator-filled waters of the North Atlantic, used to tell him over a broken radio chassis. Ray, the air around us is full of voices you can't see, full of people trying to find a way out of the dark. A bad technician just looks at the broken wires, but a master technician learns to listen to the static. The static tells you where the signal is breaking down. It tells you where the barrier is between you and the other side. If you can understand the static, you can keep the connection alive when everything else falls apart. Ray learned the heavy discipline of absolute listening. He could sit at a grease-stained workbench for 10 hours straight without moving a muscle or lifting his head, his fine tweezers holding a copper wire thinner than a human hair, letting the noise of the city outside dissolve until there was nothing left, the steady, reassuring frequency of a clear broadcast. When his draft notice arrived in the damp spring of 1967, his father had looked at the original government paper, his hands stained with gray resin from a television tube, and said absolutely nothing. The old man knew the exact weight of a government demand. He simply folded the letter, patted his son on the back with a heavy hand, and went out to the garage to smoke in the dark until the sun came up. In the Selective Service Lottery, Ray's birthday had been drawn as number 31. His fate was sealed before he could even finish his junior college degree in electrical engineering. At Fort Gordon, Georgia, the ENS instructors at the Signal Corps School realized within 3 days that Ray could read a complex schematic diagram faster than the sergeants could. Bark the commands. They didn't put him in a standard rifle square. They assigned him to specialized communications training, stripping him of his civilian name and replacing his identity with a military occupational specialty code. 05B, radio operator. They forced him to run through the Georgia red clay with a 40-pound iron block strapped to his back to simulate the crushing weight of the transmitter, screaming into his face day and night. The radio is your life, grunt. If you lose the signal, the platoon dies in the brush. You transmit or you bleed. But Ray didn't scream back. He kept his head down, learned how to program frequencies in the pitch black, how to repair a cut handset cable, using nothing but electrical tape and a copper wire from a C-ration tin, and how to keep his voice completely flat, calm, and robotic even when smoke pots and simulated artillery shells were exploding directly around his training bunker. By November 1967, the harsh reality of the Central Highlands had stripped away any academic illusion about electronics. turning the radio into a heavy, metallic cross that Ray had to carry through the mud for 90 consecutive days without a single break. His unit, Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 8th Infantry, had been jumped into the mountains around Dak-2 to counter a massive, multi-regiment concentration of NVA regulars who had dug into the ridges along the border. The terrain was an unforgiving maze of steep, vertical ravines, giant banyan trees with roots like concrete walls, and a thick layer of elephant grass that could cut a man's face open like a razor blade. The heat during the day was an active, malicious force, turning the jungle into a green steam bath where the human skin couldn't breathe, under the heavy canvas gear. But at night the temperature would drop drastically, and a heavy, freezing mountain fog would roll in from the western ridges of Cambodia, settling into the valleys like wet wool. The moisture was a constant enemy to the electronic equipment. It corroded the brass battery contacts, rusted the aluminum seal casings, and turned the canvas shoulder straps of Ray's pack into soggy bands that ate away the skin on his shoulders until his collarbones were exposed to the raw, salt-encrusted fabric. The radio itself, which the grunts called the Prick 25, was an uncompromising piece of machinery. It was housed in a sand-colored water-resistant magnesium case, containing 92 separate electronic components and a complex array of frequency synthesizers that operated in the VHF band between 30 and 75 MHz. To power the unit, Ray had to carry a heavy, brick-like magnesium battery that was notorious for leaking hazardous ammonia gas when punctured or exposed to excessive moisture. The system was designed to have a line-of-sight range of about 5 miles, but in the dense mountain terrain of Dak-2, where the iron ore in the volcanic soil acted as a natural shield, and the giant trees absorbed the signal, that range was often reduced to less than 1,000 yards. To overcome this, Ray had to use the long, tape-measure steel antenna, a 10-foot monster that vibrated and whipped through the air with every movement, catching on branches and acting as a giant visual pointer that screamed to any enemy sniper within a kilometer. Here is the center of command. Shoot here. The platoon was a collection of hollowed-out boys pulled from every corner of America, their nerves frayed to the breaking point by sleep deprivation, bad food, and the constant threat of bouncing Betty landmines that would clip a man at the waist. There was Lieutenant Miller, the platoon leader, a 22-year-old Frotki graduate from New Jersey whose eyes were permanently wide with a frantic, unblinking terror of failing his quotas. There was Kowalski, a big machine gunner from Pittsburgh, who spent his nights crying silently into his poncho while holding a lucky rabbit's foot, dipped in gun oil. And there was Doc Henderson, a 19-year-old medic from Oregon, who carried extra rolls of white gauze in his pockets instead of ammunition crates. They operated under the official Pentagon doctrine of search and destroy, a strategy managed by computers at Task Force Alpha in Thailand that relied entirely on overwhelming artillery fire and high-altitude air support to win the war of attrition through body counts. But on the ground, under the thick, dark canopy of Dak-2, the soldiers knew that the electronic sensors and the B-52 bombers were completely useless once the mountain mist rolled in. The enemy didn't fight a conventional war. They would wait in subterranean log bunkers for the fog to become so thick that the American planes couldn't see the ground. Then they would strike from 20 yards away, locking the Americans in a close-quarters embrace, where Faubin artillery could not fire without killing both sides simultaneously. On the night of November 11th, the fog was so dense that Ray couldn't see the lieutenant sitting 3 feet away from him in the defensive perimeter. Alpha Company had been split into 3 separate platoon positions along the spine of Ridge 8 and 23, isolated from each other by deep ravines that cut through the mountain like giant teeth. Ray's platoon was holding a narrow saddle between 2 high knolls, their shallow foxholes dug into the loose volcanic soil. At exactly 0200 hours, the silence of the mountain was shattered by a single, high-pitched whistle from an NVA bugle. Within seconds, a massive concentration of mortar shells and rocket-propelled grenades slams into the center of the perimeter, blowing the sandbags into sand and turning the night into a blinding furnace of orange fire and flying steel fragments. The main telephone landline connecting the foxholes was instantly severed by shrapnel. The platoon leader, Lieutenant Miller, lunged toward Ray, his face covered in blood from a splinter wound, his hands gripping Ray's shoulder with a desperate, terrifying strength that tore the fabric of his shirt. "Get the battalion on the horn, Vance." Miller screamed above the deafening roar of the explosions. "Tell them we're getting overrun. We need defensive targets dropped on the western slope right now. Move your ass!" Ray threw himself onto his stomach, his face buried in the wet leaves, his fingers working frantically in the dark to turn the dials of the PRC-25 radio. He unhooked the rubber H-138 handset, pressing it tightly against his ear, his voice remaining flat and mechanical despite the shrapnel slicing through the foliage above his head. "Cobra Main, this is Alpha 3-6. We have a hot box. Request immediate fire mission. Target area Bravo 1-2. Over." But the only response from the speaker was a loud, aggressive wall of white noise. Hiss, crackle, hiss. The mountain mist had settled into the electronic components, and the dense iron ore in the limestone karst was bouncing the radio waves back into the ground. Ray adjusted the squelch control knob, his thumbs slick with the red clay, trying to find a clear frequency through the static. Then, through the rushing roar of the white noise, a voice broke through. It wasn't the battalion headquarters at the base camp. It was the frequency of the 2nd platoon, holding a separate knoll 500 meters down the ridge. The operator was a 19-year-old RTO from Chicago named Jimmy Vance, no relation to Ray, just a boy who shared his last name and had sat next to him on the transport ship across the Pacific. Jimmy's voice was completely stripped of its military discipline. It was a high-pitched, frantic scream that sounded like a frightened child trapped in a burning house. "Alpha 3-6. This is 3-2. They're in the bunkers. They're using flamethrowers. Doc is dead. The lieutenant is dead. I'm pinned behind the command post and I've got no ammo left. Where is the artillery? Oh God, Ray. Where is the artillery?" Ray pressed the rubber transmit button on the handset, his knuckles turning white as he leaned his shoulder into the tree trunk. 3-2. This is 3-6. Hold your position. We are trying to clear the frequency. Battalion cannot see the ridge through the fog. They won't fire blind. Over. They have to fire. Jimmy's voice screamed back through the speaker, accompanied by the deafening, rhythmic roar of an AK-47 firing on full automatic directly next to his microphone. The static on the radio was rising, a thick, electronic curtain that threatened to completely swallow the boy's words. "I can hear them crawling up the sandbags, Ray. They're talking outside the hole. I've got 1 magazine left. Don't leave me out here in the dark, man. Please, don't turn off the radio." Ray looked up through the gray mist toward Lieutenant Miller. The lieutenant was shaking his head, his face white, his eyes wide with a cold, administrative calculation. "The fog is right on the deck, Vance. The artillery batteries at the landing zone said their target computers are reporting a 50% chance of hitting our own holes if they fire into that saddle without visual observers on the ground. They won't pull the lanyard. Tell them to hold. Ray didn't transmit the lieutenant's order. He couldn't bring himself to do it. Instead, he kept his finger locked on the transmit button, his face pressed into the aluminum casing of the radio, listening to Jimmy Vance's final minutes on Earth. The static on the PRC-25 was shifting, turning into a strange, rhythmic distortion that sounded exactly like the rushing of water through a broken pipe back in Toledo. Through the hiss and the crackle, Ray could hear the physical sounds of the struggle. The wet, heavy thud of a grenade exploding inside a dirt hole, the sound of metal sliding against metal, the sharp bark of foreign commands, and then a long, drawn-out scream that was cut short by a single, sharp burst of automatic fire. Then, the voice from Chicago stopped. The frequency didn't go silent. It reverted instantly to that massive, indifferent wall of white noise. Hiss, crackle, hiss, for the next 4 hours, until the sun finally broke through the eastern ridges, and the mountain mist dissolved into gray ribbons. Raymond Vance sat in the mud with the radio handset locked against his ear. He didn't fire his rifle once. He didn't move to help the ammunition bearers or carry the wounded. He just sat there, a human conductor for the agony of an entire platoon, listening to the static. Every time a different squad radio keyed its microphone in the dark, he heard the frantic breathing of boys he had eaten breakfast with, followed by the wet, choking sounds of their deaths, before the white noise swept over their frequencies like an ocean tide. The aluminum casing of the PRC-25 was dented and scarred by bullet fragments. Its green paint blackened by soot, but it kept functioning with a cold, mechanical perfection. It didn't care about the screams. It didn't care about the fog. It just turned human lives into radio waves and broadcast them into the empty gray sky. When the relief columns finally reached the saddle at noon the next day, they found a battlefield that looked like an open grave. The 2nd Platoon's knoll was completely wiped out, the sandbags torn to shreds, the bodies of Jimmy Vance and his squad lying frozen in the red clay like discarded mannequins. Ray Vance didn't look at them when the extraction helicopters arrived to haul the survivors away. He didn't wash the black carbon off his face or remove the canvas straps of the radio from his bleeding shoulders. He kept the headset in his hand until they landed at Pleiku, his thumb still resting loosely on the transmit switch. He carried that dented PRC-25 for the final 4 months of his tour of duty, a 30-pound anchor that rattled against his spine with every step he took through the Central Highlands. He no longer looked at the radio as a tool of communication. It was a pocket-sized gravestone that broadcast the voices of dead boys every time he turned the power dial. When his 365 days were finally up in the spring of 1968, Ray didn't cheer or join the party on the charter flight back to the States. He sat in the last row of the commercial airliner, his eyes fixed on the small oval window, his hands resting flat on his knees while the other grunts wept and celebrated around him. He returned to Toledo, Ohio, but the boy who had loved the clean language of circuits never came back. He took over his father's television repair shop after the old masterman passed away in 1972, but he stripped the store of its diagnostic equipment. He refused to repair radios or televisions, converting the business into a simple shop that fixed manual typewriters and mechanical clocks. Devices that operated on springs and levers. Devices that didn't use electricity and didn't generate white noise. He wanted a world where things only moved when you touched them, a world where the air was quiet. The decades passed over him like a gray fog, matching the sung mu of Dak, to that seemed to have settled permanently behind his eyes. He never married. He never went to town council meetings. And he refused to wear his veteran's cap to the Memorial Day parades, choosing instead to spend his holidays sitting on his porch in the dark while the rest of the town celebrated a glory he knew was a lie. The townspeople thought he was just another cold, eccentric veteran who had lost his edge in the jungle, a quiet man who lived on the extreme margins of a world that was too eager to forget the Fakib, failure of the war. But his family noticed that he carried a strange, agonizing affliction that seemed to control his entire mental existence. In the 1990s, when modern cellular technology began to emerge, and the world became filled with invisible digital signals, Ray's anxiety grew worse. He refused to allow a microwave or a cell phone inside his home, claiming that the air was getting crowded again. Whenever the winter weather arrived, whenever the air pressure dropped, and the cold lake mist rolled off Lake Erie, filling the streets of Toledo with a thick, gray blindness, Ray would lock the door to his shop. He would sit at his workbench under the light of a single bulb, reach into an old military sea bag, and borrowed the handset of an old military radio that he had pocketed from a supply clerk before leaving country. He would press the black rubber speaker tightly against his left ear, close his eyes, and let the quiet walls of his Ohio shop dissolve into the jungle. He wouldn't hear the music from the street or the voices of his neighbors. His brain would tune itself exclusively to the phantom white noise that seemed to bleed out from the center of his own skull, a severe case of combat-induced tinnitus that vibrated at the exact same frequency as the high mountain static. He could hear the hiss of the static, the crackle of the broken transmitter, and through the distortion, the soft, frantic voice of Jimmy Vance asking him why the artillery wouldn't fire, holding the rubber handset until his fingers were blue and his calloused palms were shaking in the dark. He lived in that frequency until his body finally gave out in the winter of 2016, his heart stopping during a blizzard that blotted out the city lights, leaving behind a silence he had spent 50 years trying to find. The official military history books would publish grand, volume technical manuals about the campaign at DAC 2, detailing battalion movements, ammunition expenditures, and strategic hill numbers down to the last digit. The generals would receive their shiny medals, and the politicians would write their lucrative memoirs about peace with honor. The veterans of the infantry knew the bureaucracy would simply wait for them to die of their wounds and their psychological cancers before acknowledging the raw, unfiltered truth of what happened on those ridges. But the truth didn't require a marble wall in Washington, D.C., or a victory speech to exist. It didn't care about who won the mountain or who abandoned the saddle. It existed in the permanent, electromagnetic ledger of a 20-year-old's guilt. It existed in the ghostly radio static that would follow Raymond Vance all the way to his final resting place in the gray soil of Ohio, a sound that would keep clicking in the dark long after the fires of the jungle had gone completely cold. If you had been in Ray's position on that ridge, would you have kept that radio handset locked against your ear to listen to your friend's final minutes, or would you have turned the volume dial to 0 to save your own sanity? Does an object carry the terror and the final words of its owners, or is it just a piece of stamped aluminum and copper wire? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you want more raw stories that peel back the myths of military glory to find the human heart underneath, make sure to hit subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for watching, and let's discover history together.